Even before the Switch Lite was announced, its rumors by way of the Switch Mini were intensified when we realized the sheer number of first-party franchises that were coming in a short window that all had one thing in common. Pokemon, Animal Crossing, Top-Down Zelda, Luigi's Mansion, and Fire Emblem have all been primarily handheld series or franchises for the last couple generations, and some even longer. Now that we know the Switch Lite is coming out, it makes all the more sense, as Nintendo seems to be transitioning their handheld audience away from the 3DS and towards the Switch, a console made not only as a handheld, but also to fill the role of home console for many Nintendo gamers. But this means that these franchises that were able to rely on some of the conveniences of the handheld form factor now need to adapt for the big screen, and the first of these was Fire Emblem Three Houses. At this point, I'm only just scratched the surface of what this game has to offer, and I can already see the hours wasting away. I think this game is a golden standard for how these primarily handheld franchises can transition to being home console experiences, and I've also got some ideas for how some of those other franchises we mentioned earlier could do some of the same as well. Let's talk about it. In terms of Fire Emblem specifically, it is certainly worth noting that not only am I only about 10 hours into the game so far, but this is also the first game in the series I have personally ever played. I'll go into more detail on that in our podcast this weekend, directly to you, which you can check out by following the link in the description, where AJ and I discuss what we've been playing, gaming news, react to your comments, and answer community questions. Check it out. A huge reason why we do this channel is to foster conversation and community around this kind of stuff. But in any case, I can already tell what this game is doing a great job at as far as making that transition, knowing what I do about the prior games as well in the series. I do want to clarify real quick, this isn't about making a purely better game, and I'm certainly not saying that the handheld entries in these series were bad in any way, or that they're supposed to make an objectively better one on the Switch now. I think you'll get what I mean as we go, but in any case, it's not, like I said, about making a better game, but it's making one that's form-fitted for a home console experience, which is inherently a little bit different than a handheld one. So I'm going to start out the gate with one word that I think absolutely encapsulates this idea of what makes a historically handheld series feel more at home on your TV, which is scope. It's a pretty broad term and means different things for different series, which also means it's easier to see what it can mean by looking at examples, rather than speaking too broadly. But the big idea is this: when playing games on a handheld device, up until now there's been an inherent understanding that there are limitations that are necessary. When the Game Boy and the SNES were being played alongside one another, no one was reasonably trying to compare what was happening on one with the other. It was just generally understood that the Game Boy could run Super Mario Land 2, whereas the SNES could have games like Super Mario World or Yoshi's Island, or similarly with Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. What this means is with the limitations of the hardware often comes greater need for imagination to represent scope. In Pokemon Blue, the objectively better version to its counterpart, when your 16-pixel tall character walked through wavy lines representing tall grass and a Pokemon appeared, it was understood that really you, a full-size 10-year-old child, actually stumbled upon a Pokemon just existing in its own world, and now you have to interact with it. So where scope comes in here is we ultimately want the games that used to require our imagination to fill in the gaps to actually start doing the exposition themselves, so that we would see a Pokemon in the world, interact with it, and go from there. Which brings us to Fire Emblem and how it's successfully pulling this off with Fire Emblem Three Houses. Realistically, you could probably stop the video now in that I've made my big point or whatever, but here's just a lot of examples about how Fire Emblem does this well, and then again talking about some other series and how they can do it well as well. So let's get going. Fire Emblem has been known for its strategy RPG combat, compelling characters and interactions, and good narratives. However, up until now, this was about the extent of the scope of the games. Cutscenes, combat, party management, and dialogue trees were beautifully woven together to give us games that were satisfying, but perhaps didn't truly give options to play as if you were your character. In Fire Emblem Three Houses, Intelligent Systems made a few changes that really flesh out this experience. For the first time ever, your you're able to control a character in a fully modeled 3D environment with gradually unlocking areas. So this alone is a great example of what we touched on before. In and of itself, it's not anything entirely groundbreaking, and for a lot of other game series, it's essentially a given. But this took an area where the series was missing some depth and added it in spades. You control your protagonist in the monastery, which is the hub for the lion's share of character interactions, random item pickups, activities, side quests, and so on. Some of this concept had been introduced in Fire Emblem Fates with My Castle, but wasn't presented anywhere near the same way it is here. There are still aspects of some of these activities that aren't completely one-to-one with real life, such as we aren't shown pulling up a fish out of the water when fishing, and other small examples like that, but they're not things you tend to care too much about. The monastery, by and large, is a huge part of what makes the game more engaging on a purely aesthetic and tactile kind of level. Another addition that was made and is completely optional is the ability to zoom into a battlefield camera when in combat. Strategy RPGs are well known for grid-based systems, and that is not going to change anytime soon. But giving the control option to have a top-down gridded map or a third-person camera where you can move your characters on the battlefield freely is a huge benefit to the feeling of grandeur, especially when your character attacks an enemy and their background is not just generic woods, but is that specific part of the battlefield modeled out behind them. And lastly, although character interactions are generally in-game models that look good but not amazing, the presentation of the actual story cutscenes are stellar. When I first turned on the game, I was hooked instantly. The intro cutscene alone is like something out of a Studio Ghibli film, and the voice acting is fantastic. I picked Golden Deer House, so I can't really speak for the students in the other classes, but mine are truly golden. So that's a little bit of what makes Fire Emblem transition well onto the home console. And if you guys know me at all, you know I play mostly handheld, but I've been playing probably about 80% docked, just because the game just feels grand. I don't know, something about it's just great. So what about these other series? What could they do to make for a better home console experience transitioning from handheld? In release order, let's start with Link's Awakening Remake. This one is a bit unusual because it's not the whole Zelda series coming over from handheld, but rather one aspect being Top-Down Zelda. Inherently, this iteration of the franchise is meant to feel of a bit smaller scope, be less immersive in a visual sense, and generally do the opposite of what we talked about before. So funny enough, many of the things that they could do here are actually things I think they've already done. I think the key word for this kind of transition would be to make things more organic. The screen scroll is gone, you don't walk on a grid like in the original, but it does seem the world is still made up of tile sets. Of course, this could be an aesthetic choice as it's a diorama-style world, but it would be a little more immersive to me for grass sections, for example, to flow into ground sections, for trees to be somewhat unique from one another, and those kinds of changes. And the other big thing to note is the soundtrack. It appears to have a chamber orchestra kind of orchestration in this case, which doesn't work for every kind of game, but is really fitting for this one. I think this way it'll feel a lot more organic, especially than a MIDI soundtrack, but even than a big grandiose one, because you've got the little dioramas, so it fits. All in all, of all these games, this is the one that will retain the most of its handheld nature, which is probably for the best to distinguish it as much as possible from the 3D Zeldas, Breath of the Wild, its sequel, and all that kind of stuff. Luigi's Mansion 3, on the other hand, is already proving to take steps leaps and bounds beyond its handheld counterpart. As there's only been one console and one handheld game, it could easily be argued that it's not even really a handheld franchise, but seeing as they also brought the original to the 3DS, it's got that much going for it. The two main things I believe will make key differences in this title are pacing and atmosphere. Atmosphere was an area where the original truly excelled. At the time, it was a graphical masterpiece on the GameCube. Upon seeing the first trailer, this was a fear many of us shared. Seeing it looked fairly graphically unimpressive. This fear has so far been massively assuaged by the E3 footage we've seen, and the atmosphere is at least graphically what we'd hoped for, although the music, characterization, and more are still yet to be seen. The second point was pacing, which is what made Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon truly a handheld game. It was broken up into mission structures, which made it better for pick up and play, but is a much less immersive and grand experience. The less time you get to play as your character, the more removed you'll feel from the game. So as few interruptions as possible will always add depth to an experience, which is what we need from a home console game. And now, the elephant in the room. There never seems to not be controversy about Pokemon, so let's address this for a minute. On the Switch, we soon will have had 2 full Pokemon entries, Pokemon Let's Go and Pokemon Sword and Shield. What's interesting is that Junichi Masuda has said that Pokemon Let's Go had a home console focus, whereas Sword and Shield is focused on handhelds. This is odd to me because outside of mechanics, I feel like this is backwards. Let's Go did allow for couch co-op, made you use motion controls, and had a Pokeball for a controller. Those are things that you could only do docked, but if removed, its home console argument wouldn't really hold up anymore. By contrast, although Pokemon Sword and Shield have controversies around the national dex and some other bits and pieces, I think it's doing things already that we expect out of a home console game. Sure, there are even more things we'd like it to do. It's a whole world that we've seen explored more in depth in other forms of media, so how could we not? But some steps they are taking, along with others that I hope they take, are the following. The wild area is frankly what most everyone, myself included, would have wanted out of a home console Pokemon game. The idea of a Pokemon Breath of the Wild could be encapsulated in an open, interactive world with different climates and environments, a free-moving camera, and Pokemon in the overworld, all of which is available in at least the wild area. It's actually possible that some of this is even the case in other areas of the game, as we've seen quite limited footage of the rest of the game, but that remains to be seen. Those are changes, though, that I'd like to see implemented across the whole game. As far as scope, one of the biggest changes I'd like to see relates to character interaction. I'd like the towns to feel like they're being lived in on their own, rather than just reactionarily to my character. NPCs should also have somewhat complex routines, rather than just walking back and forth within a few tiles in the game world, and also react differently to my character depending on the Pokemon I have and my status as a trainer, and so on and so forth. Also, voice acting is also a huge necessity to make the game increase in scope. There are a lot of changes that can be made to Pokemon, especially by nature of it just being Pokemon and being such a vast world that they've created. But these are the ones that I'll touch on for now. In any case, I'm really hopeful about Pokemon Sword and Shield when it comes out. I mean, we'll have to see. We'll have to wait and find out, but I'm pretty hopeful. And lastly, Animal Crossing, which I don't have time to talk about in this video, but AJ's got some videos about it over there, and we'll talk about it more, as time goes on. I will say, though, that some of the other franchises that I'd really like to have this same kind of treatment is Mario and Luigi RPG, Wario Land, Kid Icarus, and one of my favorite series of all time, Golden Sun. But that's what I think. What do you think? What do you think makes a game feel like a home console experience? And also, what's your favorite handheld game? Let me know all that and more down in the comments down below. We pick out some of those comments to talk about on our podcast that I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern time. And while you're down there, go ahead and give a like to the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Ring the bell for notifications, all that good stuff. And also follow us on Twitter and join Discord. I don't know, just look in the description-y link bits, and there's things that you can do to interact with us, because that's, like I said, that's the whole reason we do this show, because it's a lot of fun. That's it for me, though. Have a great week. See you next time.